History rarely repeats itself in exact form, but it has a habit of echoing with brutal precision, and right now that echo is unmistakable. On the shattered, smoke-stained outskirts of KKE, something far larger than a single battlefield defeat is unfolding. What we are witnessing is the audible cracking sound of a specific kind of Western arrogance finally collapsing under its own weight. After decades spent studying empires, their rise, their stagnation, and their eventual decay, I can say this with clarity. What is happening here is not just another setback that can be spun away with talking points or press briefings. It is a strategic disaster, one that follows the same fatal patterns that define the worst miscalculations of the 20th century. This is not chaos born of surprise. This is the predictable outcome of choices made long before the first shells landed, choices rooted in hubris rather than realism. The situation in KKE is not simply a tactical failure on the map. It is the visible closing of a trap, a tightening ring of fire and steel that any serious military analysis would have flagged months ago. Yet it was ignored, not because the danger was unclear, but because acknowledging it would have required political humility. Reports are now pouring in, not from carefully scripted Pentagon updates, but from unfiltered footage captured amid confusion, smoke, and panic on the ground. These images confirm what was long denied. The encirclement is complete. Thousands of troops, many of them among the most capable units still available, forces once positioned as the spearhead of a future counteroffensive, are now confined within a shrinking pocket with no viable exit. This moment carries uncomfortable historical weight. Some will be tempted to compare it to Bakhmut, to frame it as another grinding battle of attrition, a calculated exchange meant to exhaust the enemy. But that comparison misses the point. Bakhmut was sold as a war of endurance. KKE is something far more damning. It represents a collapse of command and control driven by political denial. Here, the problem is not simply losses, it is paralysis. Orders were issued that ignored the terrain, the logistics, and the shifting balance of firepower. Retreat, the most basic tool of military survival, was forbidden even as the operational picture deteriorated beyond repair. These decisions were almost certainly not made by commanders staring at live maps in frontline bunkers. They were made far from the mud and blood, inside air-conditioned offices in Washington and London, where perception matters more than position. This is a familiar pattern. Time and again, political leaders have convinced themselves that optics outweigh reality, that holding ground for symbolic reasons can substitute for sound strategy. The result is always the same. Soldiers pay the price for narratives crafted thousands of miles away. To understand why this disaster matters far beyond KKE, we have to zoom out and confront the deeper illusion driving it. What is unfolding here is not an isolated misjudgment. It is the physical expression of a geopolitical fantasy that has dominated American thinking since the Cold War ended. The belief was simple and intoxicating. History had ended, rivals were gone, and power could be exercised without consequence. The United States came to see itself not as one great power among many, but as the permanent manager of global order. This mindset did not appear overnight. Its roots stretch back to doctrines that openly framed entire regions as American domains. The Monroe Doctrine, conceived in the 19th century, was an early declaration that sovereignty in the Western Hemisphere existed only with Washington's approval. That idea never disappeared. It evolved, hardened, and expanded. During the Cold War, it became policy. Nations were allowed independence only so long as their choices aligned with Western economic and strategic interests. Any deviation was treated as a threat that justified intervention. The historical record is unambiguous. From Iran in 1953 to Guatemala in 1954, from Chile in 1973 to countless other covert operations, the same logic applied. Independent paths were intolerable if they challenged the dominance of the dollar or the strategic reach of Washington. The method was consistent. First came pressure, then sanctions. If resistance persisted, proxy conflicts or outright coups followed. For decades, this approach appeared to work, not because it was morally defensible or strategically sound, but because the United States possessed overwhelming advantages, it could afford mistakes, it could lose wars, devastate regions, and destabilize entire societies without threatening the core of its own power. That era is over, and KKE proves it. The failure unfolding here is the direct result of applying a Cold War playbook to a world that no longer exists. Western leaders believed they could manufacture victory through messaging and material support alone. They assumed that enough weapons shipments, paired with carefully curated media narratives, could bend reality itself. By insisting that Ukrainian forces hold positions that had become militarily indefensible purely to sustain a political storyline, they gambled everything on perception. This is where the hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore. A nation that has not fought a high-intensity conventional war against a near-peer adversary in generations is dictating battlefield decisions to a proxy force facing relentless artillery and air power. The refusal to authorize withdrawal in KKE mirrors a larger refusal to retreat from an outdated worldview. Just as frontline commanders are bound by orders that contradict the map, policymakers in Washington are trapped by an ideology that no longer reflects the global balance of power. They cannot admit that sanctions failed. They cannot accept that the Russian economy did not collapse. They cannot acknowledge that much of the world, especially the global South, has not rallied behind them, but is watching with growing skepticism. That skepticism is turning into realization, and the realization is dangerous for any empire. It is the moment when the illusion of invincibility cracks, when allies quietly reassess their commitments, and when adversaries take careful note. In KKE, that realization is being paid for in lives, and it marks the beginning of a reckoning that extends far beyond this single battlefield. When we look closely at the trapped units in KKE, we are not just observing a military failure. We are seeing the human cost of a policy that serves politics rather than strategy. The so-called no-retreat order imposed on these forces has no operational logic. It does not preserve combat power, it does not buy meaningful time, and it does not alter the strategic trajectory of the war. Its only function is to delay the admission of defeat. This is a pattern with deep historical roots. In the final stages of the Vietnam War, Washington clung to the language of peace with honor long after the battlefield situation had made such a concept meaningless. That insistence led directly to unnecessary deaths, sacrificed not for victory, but for narrative management. The same script played out in Afghanistan, where officials maintained the fiction of a stable democratic government until the very moment helicopters were evacuating personnel from Kabul. In each case, reality was ignored until it forced itself into view in the most humiliating way possible. The establishment has long relied on a combination of coercion and perception control to maintain dominance. The assumption has always been that controlling the headline means controlling the outcome, but war does not respond to messaging. Artillery shells are indifferent to press conferences. Precision missiles are not impressed by moral declarations from the State Department. The encirclement at KKE creates a strategic vacuum that cannot be spun away. These were elite formations, units with the training, morale, and experience required to stabilize collapsing fronts or conduct future operations. By burning them in a static defense, by transforming KKE into a political symbol rather than a defensible objective, the West has effectively destroyed the future combat potential of its proxy force. This decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. By sacrificing these units, any remaining leverage for negotiation is erased. Diplomacy depends on strength, or at least the perception of it. You cannot negotiate from a position where your most capable forces are surrounded and systematically dismantled. This is a strategic failure at the highest level, one that exposes a grim truth. The West is not fighting to secure Ukraine's future, but to preserve the reputation of NATO and the illusion of American dominance. The phrase "fight to the last Ukrainian" is no longer a cynical slogan. It is a policy being executed in real time. The tragedy unfolding here is not driven by emotion or ideology alone. It follows the cold mechanics of imperial decline. History shows that empires rarely recognize the moment when power begins to slip. Instead, they double down, trying to force compliance through stubbornness and escalation. That is exactly what we are witnessing. The map of KKE does not respond to declarations of resolve. Supply lines remain severed, and circling movements continue to tighten. And the world is watching what happens when arrogance is placed above adaptability. This event accelerates the global shift toward multipolarity because it shatters a central myth that Western military power is unassailable. Beijing is watching. Tehran is watching. New Delhi is watching. They are not reacting with fear, but with calculation. They see that the United States and its allies can be outproduced, outmaneuvered, and outlasted in a conventional conflict. The moral contradiction is now fully visible. The same governments that claim to defend freedom are willing to sacrifice an entire generation in a hopeless pocket to preserve their own credibility. For the global South, this is not an abstract debate. It confirms long-held suspicions about Western intentions. What we are seeing in KKE is not an anomaly. It is the kinetic expression of a deeper systemic failure that stretches far beyond the battlefield. While soldiers are being trapped and destroyed in the trenches, a parallel failure is unfolding in the financial and economic sphere. The same arrogance that dismissed military realities also misjudged the limits of economic coercion. As the Pentagon miscalculated artillery logistics, the technocrats in Washington believed they could weaponize the global financial system with impunity. They assumed that removing a nuclear-armed state from SWIFT, freezing sovereign assets, and unleashing sanctions at an unprecedented scale would bring about economic collapse within weeks. That belief was absolute, and it was wrong. The architects of this strategy fundamentally misunderstood both the structure of the modern global economy and the resilience of a state that produces essential commodities. For decades, the dominance of the US dollar functioned as a tool of control. Access to dollar clearing systems acted as a leash. Nations that deviated from Washington's preferences could be financially strangled, as seen in Iran and Venezuela. This mechanism worked because there was no viable alternative and because the targets lacked systemic importance to the global supply chain. Russia was different, and that difference was ignored. You cannot economically isolate a country that supplies the world with energy, grain, fertilizer, and critical industrial materials. In attempting to do so, the West did not isolate Moscow. It exposed itself. The resilience on display was not accidental. It was the product of years of preparation and a strategic error by Western policymakers who assumed their tools would work forever. While media outlets repeated claims of imminent collapse, the reality was a methodical adaptation, a reorientation of trade flows, reserves, and partnerships that rendered sanctions far less effective than promised. This is where the narrative of isolation collapses completely. The West is not synonymous with the world. The G7 is no longer the center of gravity. The nations that actually produce goods, extract resources, and sustain population growth largely refused to participate in what amounted to economic self-harm. What emerged instead was a sophisticated circumvention process that quietly eroded American financial leverage. Oil moved through alternative shipping arrangements. Trade was rerouted through regional hubs. And most significantly, currency usage began to shift. The foundation of American financial dominance, the petrodollar system established in the 1972, is no longer unquestioned. Energy transactions are increasingly conducted in yuan, rubles, dirhams, and rupees. By turning the dollar into a weapon, Washington destroyed the trust that sustained its reserve status. The seizure of hundreds of billions in sovereign assets sent a clear message to every central bank outside the Western bloc. If it could happen to a nuclear power, it could happen to anyone. The response was predictable. Alternatives were explored, reserves diversified, and new payment systems developed. These developments exposed the true scale of the failure. The same mindset that produced the disaster at KKE produced this economic backlash. It is the belief that power can be exercised without consequences, that coercion will always succeed, and that rivals will always fold. History suggests otherwise, and once again, reality is asserting itself. When we examine the industrial demands of the war in Ukraine, the depth of Western miscalculation becomes impossible to ignore. High-intensity conflict is not sustained by slogans or financial instruments. It is sustained by factories, energy, raw materials, and labor. For decades, the United States and much of Europe reshaped their economies around finance, services, and speculative growth, outsourcing, manufacturing, in pursuit of short-term profit and efficiency. That model works in peacetime. It collapses under the pressure of prolonged war. The promise to economically suffocate Russia exposed a fatal contradiction. The West no longer possesses the industrial capacity required to back its own threats. What we are witnessing is a collision between two economic realities. On one side stands a virtual economy built on derivatives, asset inflation, and tech valuations. On the other stands a material economy grounded in steel, explosives, fuel, and machine tools. Western leaders assured their publics that sanctions would cripple Russia's war machine. Instead, Europe's industrial core, particularly Germany, absorbed the shock. Energy prices soared, manufacturing competitiveness eroded, production slowed. Meanwhile, Russia's military-industrial complex shifted fully into wartime mode, expanding output at a pace the entire NATO alliance has struggled to match. This reversal defines strategic backfire. NATO nations have found themselves unable to produce even basic munitions at the scale required for sustained combat. Artillery shell shortages became routine. Air defense inventories thinned dangerously. Promises of unlimited support collided with empty warehouses. Russia, by contrast, increased production across critical categories, from artillery to air defense systems, benefiting from domestic energy supplies and centralized planning. The belief that economic pressure alone could substitute for industrial readiness proved disastrously naive. Behind the scenes, the anxiety in Washington is evident despite the confident language used in public. Policymakers understand that the sanctions regime has failed to achieve its stated goals. Oil price caps were ignored by global markets. Energy flows adapted. Revenues continued. At the same time, geopolitical alignments began to shift in ways that directly undermine American influence. China did not retreat under pressure. Instead, it deepened economic and technological ties with Russia, providing markets and dual-use components that offset Western restrictions. This partnership is not symbolic. It represents a functional integration of two powers that the United States once believed it could manage separately. The idea that Washington could simultaneously contain Russia and China was a product of unchallenged dominance. In practice, it has had the opposite effect. Instead of isolating rivals, it has unified them. The Eurasian landmass is consolidating into an economic and strategic bloc that is largely immune to American naval reach and financial coercion. That reality alone should force a reassessment of strategy, yet denial persists. The consequences extend beyond economics and military production. Narrative control, a pillar of Western power, is also eroding. For years, audiences were told that Russia was on the verge of collapse, that it was running out of missiles, that its economy was in free fall. These claims were repeated until they became accepted truth. But as the encirclement at KKE unfolds and economic data contradicts earlier predictions, the disconnect becomes obvious. Cognitive dissonance is spreading. People are beginning to ask why the story no longer matches observable reality. This loss of credibility is dangerous for any system built on consent and perception. Once trust is broken, it is difficult to restore. The realization is spreading that the mechanisms once thought to guarantee Western dominance are far less effective than advertised. Financial sanctions, media narratives, and military threats are no longer decisive tools. They can be bypassed, resisted, or neutralized by states willing to adapt. This leaves Washington in an increasingly constrained position. The options available to American policymakers are narrowing rapidly. Direct military intervention in Ukraine risks escalation on a scale that no one can control. Sanctioning China would inflict catastrophic damage on the global economy, including the United States itself. Diplomatic pressure is losing effectiveness as alternative institutions and alliances gain credibility. What remains is a growing sense of strategic entrapment, a maze built by years of overconfidence. At the same time, the alternatives to Western dominance are no longer theoretical constructs discussed in policy journals. They are operational realities. The BRICS framework is expanding, drawing in major energy producers and emerging economies. New payment systems are being tested and deployed. Trade in local currencies is increasing. Each of these steps reduces dependence on Western approval. Collectively, they represent a quiet but profound shift in global power dynamics. This is the scenario that Cold War strategists once feared but believed they could prevent. A self-sufficient Eurasian bloc connected by land routes, resource flows, and shared interests, capable of resisting external pressure. Ironically, it was the attempt to break Russia that accelerated this outcome. By forcing non-Western nations to confront the risks of dependence on the dollar-based system, Washington motivated them to build alternatives faster than they otherwise would have. The illusion of financial omnipotence is fading just as surely as the illusion of military invincibility. The tightening ring around KKE is mirrored by a tightening reality around Western policy. Tools that once worked reliably are now blunted. Leverage is slipping. And with each miscalculation, the cost of adjustment grows higher. If the economic and military failures represent a tragedy of incompetence, the moral dimension of this collapse rises to something far darker. It forces us to confront a truth that the Western establishment has spent decades carefully obscuring: the moral bankruptcy at the heart of the American-led order. For generations, power has been wrapped in language designed to disarm criticism. Interventions are framed as liberation. Sanctions are described as humanitarian tools. Coups are rebranded as support for civil society. This rhetoric is not accidental. It functions as camouflage, masking a system that operates not on principles, but on dominance, extraction, and control. The soldiers now trapped in the cauldron of KKE are not dying for freedom or democracy. They are dying to preserve an illusion. Anyone who has studied the aftermath of American interventionism recognizes the pattern immediately. It is not a record of nation building, but of systematic dismantling. A sovereign state resists alignment, whether by challenging the dollar system or asserting strategic independence, and suddenly it becomes a moral emergency. The public is told intervention is necessary to stop tyranny or protect human rights. What follows is devastation. Infrastructure collapses. Social cohesion fractures. Violence becomes permanent. The empire moves on, leaving behind a broken society and a press release. Iraq stands as one of the clearest examples. The justification was weapons of mass destruction, a claim later exposed as a fabrication engineered to secure domestic support for invasion. The real objectives were strategic positioning and resource control. The result was catastrophic. A functioning state was annihilated. Over 1 million lives were lost. Ancient cities were reduced to rubble. Sectarian conflict replaced secular governance, and a power vacuum gave rise to extremist groups whose violence spilled far beyond Iraq's borders. This was not a tragic mistake. It was the predictable outcome of deliberate deception, and it permanently destroyed Western credibility across much of the Arab world. Libya followed the same script with even starker hypocrisy. Prior to intervention, Libya held the highest standard of living in Africa. Healthcare and education were accessible. National wealth was being leveraged for regional development. But its leader made an unforgivable error from the perspective of Western finance. He challenged the monetary order. The proposal of a gold-backed Pan-African currency threatened to weaken both the dollar and the CFA franc. Overnight, Libya transformed from a sovereign state into a humanitarian crisis. NATO's bombing campaign, justified as a mission to protect civilians, dismantled the country entirely. Today, Libya is a failed state ruled by militias, where open-air slave markets exist under the banner of liberation. This is the real legacy of intervention. Syria was next in line. The objective was not humanitarian relief, but strategic fragmentation. Control over pipeline routes, regional influence, and geopolitical positioning drove the effort. Weapons were funneled into the conflict. Extremist factions were sanitized as moderate opposition. The risk of total collapse was accepted as an acceptable cost. Only the intervention of Russia prevented Syria from becoming another Libya, another permanent black hole of chaos. The continued presence of U.S. forces in the country is not about counterterrorism. It is about controlling oil fields and agricultural resources, effectively depriving the population of its own means of survival. Ukraine fits this pattern with chilling precision. The language is different, but the mechanism is identical. Ukraine has been transformed into a proxy, a tool in a larger contest with Russia. If Western leaders genuinely cared about Ukrainian lives, They would have supported the early peace negotiations that could have ended the war before it metastasized. Those talks were blocked. War was chosen deliberately, not because victory was realistic, but because prolonged conflict served broader strategic and financial interests. The entrapment of elite units in KKE is the direct outcome of that choice. These soldiers are being consumed in a battle that even senior military planners understand cannot be won. The objective is no longer victory. It is prolongation. Prolong the conflict to sustain arms contracts. Prolong it to justify budgets. Prolong it to enable asset acquisition and reconstruction deals once the dust settles. This is not conspiracy. It is how modern power operates when accountability disappears. The so-called rules-based order reveals itself here as selective enforcement. Rules constrain the weak. The strong rewrite them as needed. Human rights become weapons, invoked selectively to justify interventions that produce exponentially greater suffering than the abuses they claim to stop. By forcing Ukrainian leadership into a no-retreat posture under external pressure, the West has crossed from strategic misjudgment into moral crime. These decisions sacrifice lives not for defense, but for talking points at summits and temporary boosts in public approval. The rest of the world is not blind to this. The global South remembers Iraq. It sees Libya. It observes Syria. And now it watches Ukraine. The lesson being learned is brutal but clear. To oppose the United States is dangerous. To align with it can be fatal. Trust in Western moral authority has collapsed because the evidence is overwhelming. Once that moral ground is lost, power is reduced to coercion alone. And coercion, as history repeatedly shows, has limits. What is happening in KKE is therefore not just a military or political failure. It is the exposure of a system that can no longer justify itself. The moral trap has snapped shut, not on its intended targets, but on those who built it. The image of a benevolent guardian of global order is dissolving, replaced by the reality of a structure willing to burn entire nations to preserve its dominance. This is not a turning point defined by ideology. It is defined by consequence. The disaster unfolding in the cauldron of KKE is not an isolated collapse confined to a single front. It is the ignition point of a much broader reckoning, one that historians will likely describe as the moment the old order finally began to unravel in full view of the world. The West convinced itself that this war could be managed, that it could bleed both Russia and Ukraine while insulating its own system from the consequences. That assumption was a fantasy. By escalating step by step, crossing every self-declared red line from heavy armor to long-range missile systems, the United States invited responses it is structurally unprepared to counter. We have entered an era where opponents are no longer playing within the framework of Western rules. They are dismantling the framework itself. The idea of escalation dominance, long treated as a core pillar of American military doctrine, has been exposed as a myth. For decades, planners assumed the United States could always raise the stakes higher than any adversary. But the response from Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran tells a different story. They are not backing down. They are adapting, mobilizing, and restructuring their economies and industries for long-term confrontation. The encirclement at KKE demonstrates that Russia has successfully transitioned to a war economy, something Western leaders insist is politically impossible for themselves. While NATO struggles to produce enough artillery shells to sustain a week of high-intensity combat, Russian production lines operate continuously. This is not a failure of technology. It is a failure of political will and industrial depth. This asymmetry extends far beyond Eastern Europe. Look at the Red Sea, where a relatively small non-state actor has disrupted a critical artery of global trade using inexpensive drones and missiles. The response from the U.S. Navy has revealed a devastating imbalance. $1 million interceptors are being used to neutralize weapons that cost a fraction of that amount. This is not a sustainable equation. It is a slow bleed that drains resources without delivering decisive results. The adversaries of the West understand this dynamic perfectly. They avoid symmetrical confrontation and instead apply pressure where it is cheapest and most effective. KKE is the northern front of this wider struggle. The Red Sea is another. The Pacific looms as the next potential theater. And in each case, the pattern is the same. Western power is overextended, reacting rather than shaping events. China is observing all of this with calculated patience. The most damaging outcome of the Ukraine conflict for Washington is not territorial loss or diplomatic embarrassment. It is the forced convergence of Russian and Chinese interests. The belief that the United States could contain both simultaneously was rooted in an outdated perception of dominance. Instead of isolating its rivals, it has bound them together. This partnership is not symbolic, it is operational. China provides markets, financing, and dual-use technology. Russia provides energy, resources, and real-world combat experience. Together, they form a strategic depth that the United States cannot easily penetrate. In any future conflict, Washington would not be facing a single adversary, but the combined industrial and logistical capacity of the Eurasian landmass. That reality fundamentally alters the global balance of power. The economic consequences of this shift are already reaching ordinary people. Inflation is not a temporary anomaly. It is the structural cost of geopolitical fragmentation. When access to cheap energy is severed and global supply chains are deliberately disrupted, prices rise permanently. The era of low-cost goods and easy credit was built on globalization and relative stability. That era ended in the trenches of Donbass. What follows is the fragmentation tax, and it is paid by households, not policymakers. Every sanction, every block trade route, every escalation feeds directly into the erosion of purchasing power and long-term financial security. At the same time, Western governments have weakened their own defenses in pursuit of this failing strategy. Strategic stockpiles have been drained, advanced systems have been shipped abroad and destroyed. Ammunition reserves have fallen to levels that alarm military planners behind closed doors. If a direct conflict involving NATO were to erupt today, European forces would exhaust their supplies within days. The United States would face critical shortages of precision-guided munitions. This is not preparation. It is self-disarmament carried out in the name of credibility. The Global South sees this vulnerability clearly. It explains the diplomatic realignment now underway. Countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa are not siding with Moscow out of loyalty. They are acting out of self-preservation. They recognize that the unipolar moment has ended and that dependence on Western systems carries unacceptable risk. They are diversifying partnerships, trading in local currencies, and joining alternative institutions. This is asymmetric warfare at its most effective, walking away. The collapse at KKE signals that the dam has broken. The West now faces a multi-front crisis. Military failure in Europe, escalation in the Middle East, strategic pressure in the Pacific, and economic stagnation at home. The response from the establishment has been uniform: more escalation. But escalation cannot reverse structural decline. When industrial capacity is gone, when moral authority is evaporated, and when financial leverage is eroding, there is no lever left to pull. What remains is a choice, and it is a stark one. The first path is adaptation. It requires humility, restraint, and a recognition that the world is now multipolar. It means abandoning the fantasy of dominance and focusing on domestic renewal, cooperation, and realism. The second path is denial. It is the decision to double down, to print more money, to fight more proxy wars, and to silence dissent while preaching freedom. All evidence suggests the establishment has chosen the latter. The collapse of the narrative surrounding KKE offers one final gift: clarity. Legacy media promised victory. Reality delivers defeat. Officials claim strength. Everyday life reflects decline. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They decay, then fracture, then collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. We are living through that process now. The smoke rising from KKE is not just the fog of war. It is the twilight of an era that believed itself immune to history. If you are tired of propaganda disguised as analysis, if you want to understand the real mechanics driving global events, and if you refuse to remain a passive observer, then this conversation matters. History is moving fast, and the space for honest discussion is shrinking. The truth does not belong to empires in decline. It belongs to those willing to face reality without illusion.